Real quick, we could start off with just like quick introductions for those who might not know you guys. I'll just go down the list as I see them on my screen. So Patrick, if you just want to do a quick intro real quick.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. Name is Patrick. I'm currently working as an engineer at Mirror, and we're building a protocol that helps creators and communities run crypto native media businesses. And a few of the tools that we're building, we have a tokenized crowd fund, we have NFT auctions, NFT additions, revenue splits, and working on a few other things. I'm really excited to chat about DAOs because we think that that's kind of the next big thing coming in the crypto sphere these days.
Awesome. Thank you for joining, Patrick. Greg, you're next on my list. If you want to just give a quick intro for everyone real quick.
Hey everyone, stoked to be here. Stoked to be after Patrick too. We used to work together. I run a company called Late Checkout, and it's a product design agency, product studio, and fund that invest in community-based products.
Cool. Thank you, Greg. Happy to have you here. Cooper?
What's going on, guys? I'm Cooper, currently doing all things creator economy, working for a bunch of DAOs, working for projects like Audius, doing some investing and some advisory for Variant. Super big fan of Forefront and what everyone's doing here, so just happy to be here to talk about all things creator economy and DAOs today.
Awesome. Sorry, I think you're next up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I do a bunch of things, but I'm currently spending most of my time building a company called Startupy, which is a user-owned knowledge database. And a core part of the thesis for that is that a new form of organizing that makes it easier for groups of people to collaborate is not just possible, but optimal. I also angel invest and write on the future of work, and really excited about this space.
Thank you so much. Kinjal, I think you're next.
Hey everyone, great to be here. My name is Kinjal. I'm an investor at Blockchain Capital. And on the side, I also helped found Komorebi Collective, which is a DAO focused on investing in female and non-binary founders in crypto.
Super cool. Thank you again for coming. And last but not least, Ian.
Hey everyone, really excited to be here. Thanks for organizing, Carlos. My name is Ian. I am one of the investment partners at IDEO's crypto fund, and also I'm one of the co-founders of Syndicate, a decentralized investing protocol and social networking platform.
Awesome. So as you all can see, stacked lineup today. I'm super excited about this conversation. I'd like to just dig right into it. So we're calling this event DAO Summer, and that's because there's been a ton of hype around DAOs as an idea of in the crypto space and outside, right? But there's very little consensus around what a DAO is, or even sometimes what the acronym even stands for. So my challenge for you guys is, in no longer than a tweet's worth of words, and obviously we could be a little flexible there, I'd like to kick off the conversation with each guest giving their TLDR definition of a DAO, so that we can get a feel for the perspectives on stage. So we can go in reverse order. Ian, if you want to get started there.
Yes, I'm so glad that I get to go first. Okay, so we're pretty opinionated that the evolution of the term DAOs needs to go from decentralized autonomous organization to decentralized automated organization, which implies a spectrum of automation from fully autonomous, meaning no human beings, to something on the other end, which is partially automated, meaning there are human beings and a lot of them involved. In our view, DAOs, simplistically, are a crypto-based technology for better coordinating human beings and capital on the internet at scale.
Super interesting. We'll definitely come back to that. But Kinjal, if you want to go real quick with your def.
Yeah, I love that, Ian. I think I definitely agree with what Ian has said. I think maybe in more maybe layman's terms, I would say it's a community with a bank account and something to govern.
Awesome. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about it is LLCs are very much relics of the industrial era. And to me, DAOs are just digitally native business entities. And what they do is they enable small groups of people to create and share wealth and form strong social bonds in digitally native formats.
Interesting. Cooper, I know you just wrote a piece about this, so you should have a very concise definition.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to say that DAOs are an online working group with a shared cap table and a bank account.
Cool. So we're starting to see some similarities. Greg?
In tweet format would be a DAO is often referred to as a decentralized autonomous organization. I think of a DAO as a democratic autonomous organization. A DAO is the most democratic way to build your organization.
Awesome. And Patrick, if you want to close this off real quick.
Yeah, so I think about DAOs as similar to what Sari said, where DAOs are internet native business entities. So whether that's incorporating, financing, monetization, governance, etc., all of that is done by software, code, and with humans at the center.
Cool. Yeah, the reason I wanted to start off with this question is because in all conversations about this topic, I think there's a few different threads that there's a bit of a debate over, right? So Ian, you started off with your very opinionated definition of a transition from decentralized autonomous org to decentralized automated org. Can you dig in a bit as to why you think like that is the key elements of a DAO and like what makes it a special sort of organization?
Yeah, I guess sort of really simply, I think that DAO, the word DAO obviously came up many, many years ago. And the most famous DAO was the DAO in 2017 or something like that. And it sort of envisioned this fully autonomous organization with no people, right? And that very much represented and still represents, I think, the vision and ethos of the crypto and decentralized community, which is like, you know, these organizations that sort of are just completely smart contracts that just self-govern and allocate resources without human beings. And what we would posit though is that if you actually think about what DAO technologies are, is they are really social technologies. They're about, yes, they are about connecting smart contracts and different sort of like decentralized services and things together. But I think that really the potential is about coordinating human beings and capital around those human beings across the internet in totally and new and radical ways to invest in things or govern things that they really care about at a community level. And so if you think about DAOs, you know, not just as kind of this smart contract technology or whatever, but more broadly as the social technology between smart contracts, people, and everything in between, I think it actually opens up the aperture and design space for DAOs in a really interesting way. So, for example, like, you know, we're inspired a lot by what the Mirror project has been doing around crowdfunding. Like, that is not, in my opinion, like a completely autonomous thing. It's actually very much leaning into this social aspect around bringing together communities to fund things that maybe wouldn't otherwise get funded. Like, that's amazing. And that's not autonomous. I mean, there are automated portions of it, but it does extremely rely on human beings. And I think that we think about that in a very similar way with Syndicate, where we're kind of looking at it from the investor side of the market, around bringing together people, communities, and investors together to, you know, support and back things that they care about that may you know, have otherwise not received the resources that they deserve.
Definitely, yeah, that's a super interesting perspective. And I think a lot of the other definitions that were thrown around and we were going around brought up this term of like digitally native business or crypto native organization. I'll open up this question to the pool, but I'm wondering, do you guys think that a DAO or DAO as a term is an umbrella term for any sort of internet native or crypto native business, or is a DAO a particular type of organization and we might see other crypto or internet native businesses pop up as the space becomes more mature? Whoever wants to take that one.
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I definitely think it's an umbrella term. I think that the word DAO has a very wide spectrum associated with it. And to Ian's point, I definitely agree with the more human first nature of things. I think what will happen over the next year or two is we'll see better definition around what the government classifies as the DAO, like legally on paper. But up until then, I think it's more of an ethos than it is like a strict definition. And so I definitely feel like that umbrella term is very accurate. We're just going to see different subsectors of that form over the course of the next couple of years here.
Yeah, and I also really like Cooper's recent post where he slices up the DAO landscape as there's investor DAOs, there's DeFi protocols or DAOs, and even within investor DAOs, there's some that are just a Telegram with a multi-sig. There's others that have more sophisticated ways. It seems like his Syndicate DAO is helping with automating a lot of that and building those systems. And so I think also getting really specific around what is the mission, what is the purpose of it. And I think it could span everything, from collectors to artists to writers and all sorts of creative work.
I'm curious, building off of that, do we see a world in which the use case of the DAO fundamentally changes like the function and potentially like the definition or subset of a DAO that we're using? Or to Cooper's point, are they all DAOs using the same sort of technology and the same sort of stack and philosophy, and they just serve different use cases depending on what the purpose is?
I think I kind of envision a world where we start to see like generalized horizontal infrastructure that many DAOs use. And, we've already started seeing different frameworks there, but kind of widely adopted standards at sort of the base level. And then depending on specifically what type of DAO you're building, there might be a more specialized stack on top of that. But it's still definitely early days. I imagine, as we have all these different DAOs using different processes for on-chain voting or for social like communication and so on and so forth, it gets a little hairy quickly. And so I think over time we'll start to see a little bit of consolidation.
I also personally think the term will evolve. Right now, the term works because it mostly is applied to the blockchain industry, and most of the DAOs haven't really touched traditional areas. But the way I see it is there are a lot of benefits to DAOs, some of which apply to some organizations, transparency, governance. In my case specifically, what I'm most interested in is this idea of liquid super teams that Taki wrote about recently. And, I just think that the idea of a long-term career is being replaced by just a bunch of interesting projects, and being able to kind of flexibly come in and out, and tokens are just such a powerful mechanism to enable that. But that's just one of the many benefits. And so I do think that we'll hopefully evolve these definitions because different organizations are attracted to different elements of DAO.
Yeah, and one thing that we've noticed at Mirror is that crypto is already hard enough to use with just say setting up MetaMask, fiat on ramps, submitting transactions, understanding the mental model around paying for gas. And so we kind of pretty opinionated on the idea of being as integrated as possible, at least at first, in order to understand what is the best experience we can provide. And one example of this is we love Gnosis and Gnosis Safe, but we found that it was a bit difficult to on-ramp onto Mirror just using a multi-sig and getting multiple people to confirm a transaction, and especially for hopefully the next millions of people that we hope to onboard. And so instead we just ended up building our own just very focused, very simple publication roles contract. And so I think that we'll also see some of that as well, where these more domain specific or use case specific, protocol specific tools will end up integrating certain parts of the stack that they can, and then integrating where they can with others, but then also kind of owning the experience if possible.
Yeah, to that point, I think that a lot of the base infrastructure has been built by people like the Gnosis team, and really like we feel at Syndicate. I'm sure I speak for others as well, that we're like, really standing on the shoulder of all these giants that really pioneered these frameworks and tools and pieces of infrastructure over the last 4+ years. And I think that from a tech stack perspective, where things are going, it are these sort of UX, user interface, and wrappers on top of this core infrastructure, and also building out some of the core infrastructure that hasn't yet been kind of created. But really, I think that this is the next phase of DAO tech, which is user interfaces, applications, integration platforms, and wrappers that start to take this underlying technology to the mainstream in a way that more people can easily use. It's a good sign already that people are sort of YOLOing into these Gnosis safes. That I think sort of speaks to the existing demand, for this technology. But what's really exciting to me is, as things like Mirror, as things like Syndicate, and these other platforms really start to abstract and simplify the user experience, like, I think that's going to unlock a whole new wave of end users, potentially millions or hundreds of millions in the next few years, and that to me is super exciting for DAOs, but also for crypto generally from an adoption perspective.
Yeah, I'd love to transition from that actually, and dig into this idea of DAOs for the mainstream. One of the promises of DAOs, at least in the eyes of some people, is this idea of trustless cooperation. And however, the rhetoric around this idea of squads or a group chat with a shared bank account implies that there's some level of trust and like true relationships between the individuals within the DAO. So am I wrong in thinking that these are conflicting viewpoints? And if so, how do we feel that those could be reconciled?
So I think that in some ways, I can see how that might come across as conflicting viewpoints. I think what's interesting, though, is people are now building trust via like online communication. There's a lot of ideas around on-chain reputation and how you can sort of build some sort of score that shows how you potentially have contributed to other DAOs in the past. And I think there are going to be ways to sort of identify members of any particular community who might have a reputation of some sort, particularly on-chain. And so over time, I imagine that it's not so much that you have to have like a real life relationship or that you kind of chat on the regular outside of the DAO, but more kind of how you engage within the DAO and build that trust over time, rather than having, a really trusted relationship from day one per se. But I think we're starting to see some interesting, things like DeFi passports or on-chain reputation that'll make way for this to scale.
Yeah, just to jump in here, this is an interesting story around the origins of the Syndicate project. Actually, how it began was almost 3 years ago. Will and I, who met each other while at IDEO, we actually started researching back in 2017, 2018, not DAOs, but decentralized social networks. And there were a number of key learnings back then, which was namely that it was too early for that kind of thing to exist. But the key learnings from that work that Will and I did that formed the foundations for Syndicate years later was, number one, that decentralized social networks in crypto and DeFi are primarily useful, at least in the near term, when there involves kind of the management of finances, money. We would think of that today as like a treasury. So that was kind of like interesting insight number one, before DAOs were really kind of like a big thing. The second insight was that decentralized social networks and social graphs actually start to create really interesting pseudonymous identity and reputation and social graph data when you actually start to track what people invest in. And that kind of social graph that's based on what people choose to spend their money on or invest and back is actually just as, if not more powerful than today's social graphs that exist in Web 2 around follows and likes and like eyeballs. And so that's a long way of saying that I think that connected to what I was saying earlier about DAOs being social technologies, is that if DAOs are social technologies, they are actually social financial technologies or social financial networks that we haven't seen before in Web 2. And when you think of DAOs as social financial networks, they are going to create social financial graphs on chain that are going to unlock really, really interesting, powerful use cases and applications on top of them that don't yet fully exist in Web3 today. I look at like, what we're doing. I also see Brian Flynn in here with Rabbit Hole. I think that, he's doing some really interesting things from a social financial graph perspective. And what's going to happen kind of when those open social financial graphs start to come online at scale in Web3 is really exciting. I would say that maybe that's like a year or two out, but that's going to unlock these applications that we haven't seen yet.
In your opinion, just curious, how do the Web 2 companies evolve into this new world, or do they?
Is that a question to me or someone else?
Yeah. Question to you.
By Web 2, do you mean like fintech companies or social network companies? Or what?
Yeah, social networking companies. So like you're saying, to play it back basically to you, what you're saying is there's this new wave of social technologies that actually look a lot like social finance companies. And it's this interesting hybrid, and we're going to unlock so many new use cases. I'm just curious if you think, the Facebooks of the world are going to play a role in this future.
Yeah, I mean, it's a super fascinating question, and again, we're like pretty far out from understanding it, but I do think that there are some things to learn from what's going on in DeFi right now. So the TLDR is kind of two things. One is I'm not particularly bullish that centralized companies will be able to compete with decentralized networks in the future, like full stop. And that applies to DeFi, but that also applies to social networks in the sense that what I think is going to happen in Web3 with DAOs and crypto is that they are going to create what I call open social graphs. And the nature of social graphs, which are really social financial graphs in Web3, they're going to be open, they're going to be global, and they're going to be composable, which is actually the third part is, in my view, the most interesting thing about social graphs in Web3 as compared to Web 2. And so effectively what Web3 social financial graphs are going to do is they're going to completely unbundle Web 2 social graphs, which in my mind implies that centralized companies and siloed companies and social graphs like Facebook, LinkedIn, others are not going to be able to compete at the same scale as Web3 social networks and social graphs. So that's like point number one. Point number two, very simplistically, is that, the same thing could be argued for DeFi. But what I think we're seeing, you look at like Compound's announcement a couple of days ago and other things, is that there is this kind of collaboration between CeFi and DeFi, or fintech and DeFi networks. And I think that the same thing's going to happen ultimately with social networks, where, Facebook, LinkedIn, and others may like basically be these like centralized sort of applications and like kind of permission networks that live on top of open social financial graphs in the future.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe just add in there for a second. This week in the music industry, we saw Tidal and Square talk about their merger. On Monday, there was a nice Twitter space between Jack and Jay-Z, and they were talking about NFTs, smart contracts, kind of the future integration of this technology. And I think there's a world in which a lot of these players enter the space in a very centralized way. But at its core, I totally agree with Ian that there will be these open base layer protocols that will enable far more opportunity. It's really just going to be a matter of how they choose to enter that space and what degree of permissionlessness, decentralization they choose to do in exchange for that accessibility that I think that a lot of us are used to with, more bespoke solutions like something like Nifty Gateway, for example, and NFTs. So they're definitely going to play a role here, but I think we're still going to see whether or not that's something that pans out beneficially, or if we're just going to recreate the same systems of old again.
Cooper, real quick follow-up question for that. What do you think recreating the same systems of old again would look like in this case?
Pretty much just having a centralized solution that is custodial. It's basically the same as you have your bank account or Venmo account today, which is very efficient. It gets the job done, but I think that it kind of strips away a lot of the core benefits of composability and the things that we all really know and love. So basically having a siloed ecosystem in which a set of whitelisted apps can interact with one another, but outside of that very well-defined ecosystem, there's not really a lot of connection with kind of the wider Ethereum ecosystem or any of the future ecosystems to come. So, I think it's really just about cross-chain composability without going too deep down the technical side of things. The degree to which these platforms choose to integrate and support the technologies that exist today, I think is going to be the indicator of how, compatible they are with what's happening in the wider space.
Awesome. Appreciate that explanation. Okay, cool. I want to transition this really quick, and I know some of our speakers are going to have to jump at the half hour, so if that's the case, feel free. Appreciate all of you. The next part of this conversation, kind of want to transition to why now. So DAOs have definitely caught fire in the last few months to a year, and while there's been a ton of work being done in the space, they haven't really caught mainstream attention in tech or media until very recently. Why do we feel that's the case, and what trends do we think will continue to make DAOs more popular in the years to come?
I'll jump in real quick before I head out. I mean, I forgot what speaker. I think it might have been Ian who said, we're standing on the backs of giants with some of the technology, that core infrastructure that's been created. But I think that, while I agree with that, I think that there's still so much more to be built to make it really not just easy, but attractive to all sorts of organizations, not just early adopters like us, to jump on the bandwagon. So I think that I think it's just about how do we communicate. I'm happy you asked that question around what is a DAO in the beginning. I mean, how do we collectively, as people interested in DAOs and people building DAOs, and communicate to the world why we believe it's the future, and why it's really the best. It's it's an amazing alternative, and it's easy, fun, simple, and useful.
Yeah, I think there's probably a few tailwinds. There's a lot that happened with Robinhood, Wall Street Bets. There's COVID, where you have creators looking for other forms of monetization and revenue. There's the tooling and infrastructure that's been built. I think one core thing, or at least one perspective I have on it, is just the idea that over the past few months, a lot of these protocols, creators, artists, they've gotten a lot of on-chain cash flow and on-chain revenue. And so they go onto this NFT marketplace, or maybe their DeFi protocol, and they started earning a lot of fees or revenue or sales, and it's going to this wallet that lives on chain. And they're okay, well, I don't necessarily want to, there's probably some that want to convert to stable coins and then off ramp through Coinbase or whatever. But there's this massive theme park, and there's a bunch of rides. And I see all these other people that also now have a lot of these tokens. And so now what do we do? It's it's more fun if we coordinate, if we have a group of people Please Your DAO, and we buy up artists, and we kind of reinvest in the ecosystem as well. And so I think that on-chain cash flow piece, that's one core part of it that I think is super important. And of course, at the end of the day, it's not all about the money, it's about the human connections. It's about doing something fun. It's kind of a real life video game in many ways. And so, but I think that is one accelerant, and I think that's something that is definitely going to keep accelerating it going forward.
Yeah, the other piece here, I think, outside of the technical piece and what Patrick mentioned on-chain cash flows, is I think that we're seeing kind of this unbundling of traditional employment. And we went from working bullshit jobs at large companies to now, running paid newsletters off of Substack, and this kind of creator economy world where the individual is the atomic unit. And I think we're now kind of beginning to bundle back up with each other and realizing that there's this interesting collective middle ground that acknowledges the human need for both autonomy and belonging. So I think there's something there that, we're shifting trust away from institutions towards individuals. We didn't really have easy to use tools to make an independent career possible before. We do now. And so I think that the tooling for this like new kind of redefined collectivism is gonna unleash this new wave of DAOs, because you're essentially like combining all this technical infrastructure with this real human desire to not work for a corporation or by yourself, but this like interesting middle ground of working in groups that acknowledge our primal drive really to be autonomous, but also belongs to something.
Just to piggyback off that, I would say, like, you know, sorry. Actually, how do you pronounce your name? Is it sorry? I don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, sorry. That's fine.
Okay, great. So what you just said is very interesting. I mean, just if you think about like historically what is happening even beyond the crypto space, you know, I think we are starting to see with this new technology the emergence of a new type of way of coordinating capital and coordinating human beings, which necessarily implies that where this is all leading is actually like a new model for resource allocation in the form of like capital formation and allocation, and also a new form of organization and new forms of work, right? So I think that like even before DAOs, even well before crypto, the world has been going this direction inevitably. And what crypto and DAOs are doing is just accelerating the world towards that desire and need, which is that, as Sari, you were saying, like people and communities want more agency. They want more control over their destinies and futures. And these organizations that have been created during the industrial era that have been optimized for efficiency and profit seeking, essentially, you know, it worked in the many decades where there was kind of unlimited sort of growth and all that stuff. But in today's society, like we need new alternative structures for people to gain that agency back, as opposed to just being completely extracted from. And so I think that, like, you know, the world hasn't been able to put its finger on this like pain point and need, but now DAO technology is starting to show that there is this alternative path, this like alternative option that people can opt into. And so, you know, there are so many organizations of people that, you know, like Kinjal with Komarebi, where, you know, it was 35 women and allies coming together to invest in more female and non-binary founders in the crypto space globally. And they just did that via DAO really quickly to affect that change like super quickly. You know, there are multiple kind of alumni groups from big Web2 companies that are now leaving those companies, you know, big tech companies here in the Valley, where their next job is actually not with a corporation. It's just being employed by a fully decentralized DAO. And they don't ever intend to go back to sort of like these corporate structures in the future if they don't have to. They just want to work for a DAO. And like, I think that it just, you know, speaks to this really deep desire for people globally to take control of their lives, to assemble with communities that you know they're aligned with, and for those communities to invest in and resource things that they care about. And that's really really exciting. And I think that's why in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to not, you know, it's not going to be like hundreds of thousands or millions of DAOs. I think there are going to be billions of DAOs.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. I think there have been conversations happening for decades around these ideas, and like cooperative circles and mutualist circles around how can we as communities like reclaim ownership over the institutions that we're a part of, and how can we like better facilitate the organization and transaction of the resources that we have, right? And I think Ian, actually, you tweeted fairly recently something along the lines of what matters more than the technology itself is the way that the people are using the technology, and ensuring that like those are the ideas that are like up front and most prevalent in the conversations that we're having is important to make sure that those goals are being achieved, right?
Yeah, because I think it matters how these technologies are applied. Like, you know, technologies are neutral, but what defines, whether or not they are good, like net better or worse for society, is how they are applied. And that ultimately comes down to the people that develop those technologies and apply those technologies. And so I'm very optimistic. I think, like probably everyone in this space here, that DAOs represent potentially one of humanity's best hopes to actually start to make the world more equal and fair and democratic for people and communities all over the world, right? Because let's be honest, like today's capital structures, as well as like structures for work, there's tremendous inequality in opportunity, access, and wealth. And we need alternative solutions. And I think that is DAOs to start to balance that, because otherwise society is not going to be able to sustain this forever or much longer.
Awesome. Yeah, totally agree. I think it would be cool to get in like one more rapid fire rounds, similar to the question that we had at the beginning around this idea, similar to what Ian kind of just said. What are you most excited about in the DAO space in the next like year or two, so shorter term? And then we could open up the stage to audience questions if you guys would like. So Patrick, I'd start with you on that one.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm really interested in what a crypto native business could look like. And so similar to how we've seen platforms like Substack and Shopify allow people to quit their jobs and be a full-time writer or be a full-time e-commerce merchant. Yeah, the next version of this with crypto is going to be super compelling, where you have, like what Sari mentioned earlier from Packy's post around liquid super teams, people just spinning up together to create creative projects, whether it's around writing or art or some other creative format. And then also the really interesting part is when you start allowing these different communities to collaborate and either to invest in each other or to just collaborate creatively. I think for one example that we think about a lot is these creator funds. So for example, a lot of these creator focused platforms that have a creator fund, they'll raise say like $1, $5, $10 million, and then they'll decide, their executive team will decide who gets the funding, what the terms are, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think a decentralized version of that will be driven by the community. They decide through some sort of governance process. They'll be paid in equity, and so they'll get a better share of the actual upside that they're creating for the platform. And so I think just rethinking a lot of the things that people have been mentioning around how people work, how they collaborate on projects, how they earn a living, and then also how they reinvest in the ecosystem as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and excited to see what Mir comes up with on that, because you guys are definitely doing big things there. Cooper?
Yeah, I'd say on my end, seeing more advancement on DAO servicing and specifically treasury management. I think we're in the early stages right now of all these DAOs having a ton of tokens and capital that they're able to govern, but we're still very, very early on seeing that capital actually be deployed in an effective manner. So one thing I'm really looking forward to is, what does it mean for a DAO to employ 10 plus contributors? What does it mean for a DAO to do a Series A funding round? What does it mean for a DAO to do token swaps with other projects? Really basic actions at its core, but I think we're going to start to see some really exciting developments in them being, basically formal companies in nature, but having this all happening on chain in a decentralized, permissionless way.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that businesses are the institution that we see first revolutionized by DAOs, but it's exciting to think how, as the technology develops and it gets more mature, different organizations will be disrupted as well. Sorry.
Yeah, I think the way that I see it is, fundamentally, what we need to do is lower the cost and complexity of starting a business. And, if you have three friends coming together to hack something over the weekend, the forming an LLC, incorporation, compliance, accounting, equity grants, all of that stuff is, it's just such a burden. And so I think the real promise is just a new digitally native format that understands that work is evolving. And I think that, that what's most interesting for me is just this idea of rewarding contributors in a very kind of fluid way. It's very slow and expensive to reward small contributions. You don't see equity grants for, $500. But, I think that can unlock really exciting behavior. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Kindle?
Yeah, so I guess I would build on the idea of DAO tooling and servicing. I think one area that I've been thinking about a lot more is what does the social layer of governance potentially look like? I think right now a lot of DAOs are kind of chatting amongst many different platforms, whether that's Discord or Telegram or Discourse or Snapshot or whatever that may be. But in the future, I would imagine that there's maybe a more unified way to kind of fit all the pieces together and just socialize with, subcommittees or broader committees and see what everybody's working on and really coordinate. So I'm super excited about, a few different solutions in that space that I've seen and hope that we'll see some more.
Yeah, there's an entirely new conversation to be had about DAO governance and tooling that we could probably stay for another couple hours and have, but maybe next time for sure. It's fascinating stuff. And Ian, you want to wrap up there before we get to audience questions?
Yeah, sort of near term, I think treasury management, capital allocation, and governance. I think medium term, intra-DAO workflow management, I see as a big area of opportunity in the next 2 to sort of 3 years. And then sort of the 2 to 5+ year time frame are Web3 financial social networks and the applications that emerge from that, which I'm actually most excited about, but it's going to take a little bit of time to get there.
Definitely. Appreciate you guys and all of the thoughtful answers. If anybody has any questions for comments from the audience that want to come to stage real quick, just raise your hand. And we can crank those out for the last 10 minutes. And I know speakers, some of you guys had to go early, so if any of you have to go, feel free. Really, really appreciate you all coming out. We'll give it a second to see if anybody is raising.
Me?
Yep.
Awesome. And by the way, huge fan of the forefront Metafactory Drop. I got one of their shirts. They're awesome.
Super comfortable.
Yeah, very comfortable. Quick question on incentivizing people on contributing to DAOs. What would you guys say is the best model and best way to reward people for contributing to the DAOs?
I'll step in here very quickly. So it's a great question. I think that figuring out how to actually pay people at scale through a DAO is a really challenging problem. Some tools that I'm seeing emerge that are really promising. One called Coordinate is pretty awesome. Basically, you take a pool of tokens, you assign all the people who created value and let them vote amongst one another to figure out how to distribute that. The Bankless DAO just did a really cool experiment running their first Coordinate distribution. Would highly recommend checking that out. SourceCred is something that we use very actively in FWB. So this basically assigns everyone an internal balance in cred. And based on how active they've been in that Discord, you can then reward them with a fixed amount of tokens distributed pro rata to all participants. So I think for, across the board distributions, those two tools work great. And what we're starting to do now with FWB is empower team leads with monthly budgets to then go ahead and allocate that to, contributors as they see fit. So right now we're kind of in a middle ground where there's a bunch of tools available for it, and you're kind of just throwing them all at the wall to see what sticks. But I think over, this next 6 months, we'll see some pretty good standards emerge for how to pay not only core contributors, but also team leads and more passive participants as they kind of flow through the DAO.
Yeah, and I view rewarding contributors, building off Cooper's point. Yeah, I viewed in 3 different main components. One is, so you have peer-to-peer reviews. And so that's Coordinate. And so you can decide, okay, it's not a top-down decision where it's hey, this is the contract you're getting and yeah, take it or leave it. It's based off of your contribution. And that does make it more fluid where, this month I'm willing to spend 40 hours, next month maybe 10 hours, etc. So I think that's super fascinating, the peer-to-peer review system. And then second, there's streaming payments. So there's products like Superfluid where now instead of waiting, getting paid every 2 weeks, now you can get streamed payments every time there's a block confirmation on Ethereum. I think that's super fascinating as well. And so that can solve a lot of liquidity problems. And there's also a bunch of crazy stuff eventually with DeFi where you can securitize those and tokenize them and loan them out and get loans based off of your future earnings potential. And so I think that's super interesting. And then the third area is around equity. And so getting paid in actual equity in the underlying protocol that you're helping. So I think those 3 will really change the nature of freelancing and work in general.
Just to jump in, I think there are actually a lot of things to learn from the non-crypto world in terms of incentivization and motivation, namely like extrinsic and intrinsic rewards. So extrinsic, I think that there obviously are ways to like pay people and there's like lots of cool stuff that have already been mentioned there. I think the more powerful thing is actually giving people ownership in, these networks and organizations in the form of, or something like kind of equity, obviously. And that's, I think, been validated by lots of things outside of the DAO world. But I also want to just point out that like communities especially should not underestimate the power of intrinsic motivations and rewards. Things that are not specifically extrinsic in nature, but for example, like being able to even signal that you are a part of something, and that you contributed to something, even if there was no sort of like financial benefit. And what's really cool is like, there's now that on-chain history. If the application or things that live above it actually surface that information kind of in the form of like a social financial graph, as I was like referring to earlier. And there are even things like NFTs, for example, that can not only, prove that sort of like patronage and contribution, but actually like represent it digitally in the form of this sort of like, asset that can be exposed and transferred even on these networks. And so I think that that's actually like a really exciting area for the future where, yes, you may get paid. Yes, you may get equity, which are very, very powerful, but also you can start to show and almost like flex and signal what you are a part of, what you've contributed to, what communities best reflect your principles and values, and you can prove it on chain, and the potential kind of like applications of that are, in my mind, pretty profound, and we're going to start to see a lot of that, I'm sure, in maybe a year or so.
Yeah, and even some of the early things like POAP, where you can get badges for attending things like this and being able to prove that you were so early, I think is awesome. And the fact that we have this ledger that people will be able to look back on and almost act as your resume in the future on like how much you've contributed is going to be awesome. One other question too, because I've seen a lot of communities do the initial offering very, very differently, and I think it does really depend on the community. But what do you guys think are maybe some best practices when you're looking at initially distributing tokens? Who do you choose? Who will get the airdrop? How do you like divvy up those coins and make sure that it's in a way that the community can build off of?
It's a good question. I'll take a first stab at this. Would love to hear other people's thoughts on it. I think carving out a fixed allocation of the supply that all the early contributors get to vote on collectively has generally worked pretty well. So anywhere from, let's call it 5% of tokens to 15% of tokens, and working with those core 5 to 10 contributors to assign allocations across the board. And the couple of times I've run these experiments, you actually find that the distributions work themselves out in the way that they should. So most importantly, have an open conversation with the people that are getting the tokens, and then try and find a fixed allocation of tokens to work with in the first place. So there's not a lot of discrepancy around how much you're distributing.
Awesome. Adam, appreciate the great questions. Rayhan, you on stage?
Yes, I'm out here. I actually just want to touch on something that Greg, who actually Patrick, all touched on earlier, as in why DAOs, why now? And I think one thing that actually is huge is thinking about kind of classical or OG institutions and how much we would dread stuff like one-on-one reviews or hitting like KPIs for an org, or even like, if you're at Google, like dealing with OKRs, and how alignment works in an organization. With a DAO, it's so much easier because the idea is out there and the intrinsic motivation is there as well. Like, hey, I know what I'm doing and I know how I can help this succeed. And I know what my parameters are for experimentation as a contributor. I think all of that is so huge versus, say, being at a larger like Fang or what have you, where you might not know what you're doing for the first 3 to 5 weeks of your gig. You're just getting to know and learn people. And something like the social low stakes setting of being in a Discord, where hopefully people are managing the community in a way that makes people feel heard, is a lot easier. And I think that's kind of going to be a huge soft signal shift towards Web3 and DAOs in general.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's the tailwinds are coming from so many different angles that it's almost inevitable that this sort of organization is going to spread very quickly. But it's always interesting to see like the difference in tailwinds between like the technological developments versus like the personal and social developments like you described. So
hey, so I had like 2 questions for you guys. The first one was, in regards to, CX, like how critical do you guys think that'll be as, you try to onboard or I guess like, reach more people and, bring them onto, the blockchain and DeFi essentially. And like things like, I know a lot of folks in the crypto and blockchain space who are previously or have previously worked at SaaS companies, and what are some findings and learnings from those, I guess, experiences that you guys have seen transfer over to the crypto and blockchain space? Like, well, it's like, remain consistent, and what has been different with CS? Yeah.
Customer experience, you mean?
Yeah, customer experience, because that's one of the things that I feel like has been a challenge, like as I've tried to introduce, family, friends, and other people to blockchain tech. It's just like, they're not tech savvy or so it's like, it's confusing or it's challenging, the whole private key thing, just a lot of things that can go wrong. And so it's like, I was curious, like, what efforts or some of the, I guess, leaders in the DeFi space, putting in place to try to make sure that that's like not a burden,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, as an IDEO person, I don't believe in customer or user experience. No, just kidding. No, it's super, super critical. And we really believe that user experience, great user experience design is actually going to lead adoption. And by user experience and customer experience, maybe customer experience is a much better framing than like UX UI, is that like CX and UX is much, much broader than just the interface. It's like literally the end-to-end customer journey from the second that someone hears about a product to the final moment where they choose to hopefully share that with someone else because they love it so much, right? And everything in between, which the interface is just an important, but just a piece of that, broader UX CX. And so I think that I've been in the crypto space for 7 years, and for the more than the first half of it, there were almost no designers and no UX and CX people touching this thing because it was, very esoteric, and I don't think people valued or even understood the role of CX and UX as it relates to crypto. But I think what we're finding in crypto broadly and DeFi more recently, and then especially as it relates to DAOs, because DAOs are social technologies, is that UX and CX is actually going to be the differentiator in terms of how, and what gets adopted and what wins. So I look at Mirror, for example. They're doing an amazing job at driving adoption of DAOs without saying DAOs. People are using it to crowdfund and support things that matter to them without even knowing that there's a DAO necessarily behind it or whatever. And I think that Syndicate is thinking of it similarly, and there are many others too. And I would just take a step back, which is, 2015 or even before that, and all the way through 2017, it was this kind of layer one infrastructure kind of phase, and people were just really focused on that. And then around 2017 to 2020, or even right now, the focus has actually moved up the stack to the application layer, right? With these app chains and things like that, like Compound and DeFi and all this other stuff. But it doesn't stop there. It's going to keep moving up all the way up to the UX and social layer. And when it starts to do that, it's going to really sort of the winners are going to differentiate based on UX, CX. And it'll differentiate based on those both protocols, applications, and services that in the right ways abstract the underlying sort of technical infrastructure and stuff, so that more and more users that are not like these power users that are going through all these like frictions and hoops that normal mainstream users would not go through today. It abstracts that so that the next 100 million or billion users don't have to like do all these weird things like, maybe they'll still have a MetaMask, but like get a MetaMask, like go to Uniswap, like trade it for a token, then stake it into like a bonding curve, and then get like, these derivative tokens out and then do something else with it. It'll just like, the applications will completely abstract that process. And those are the things that are going to get adopted.
Thank you so much. That was a great question, Isaiah. And thank you, Ian. And I know a bunch of our speakers had to leave at the hour, but appreciate everybody for hopping on. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm excited for DAO Summer and to continue having these conversations. But yeah, stay in the loop with Forefront on the future Hangouts. They're usually happening in our Discord. We wanted to make this one a bit more public on Twitter Spaces, and I'm thinking it went well, so we'll probably do this again in the future. But appreciate everyone for hopping on. Thank you, Ian, so much for joining. And hopefully we'll see each other again soon.
No, I guess I'm the last one standing here. That either makes me really cool or not cool. Probably go with the latter here. So
definitely cool. Definitely.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.